Why 3 a.m. wake-ups increase after 40? You may have noticed something unusual starting to happen after your late 30s or early 40s. You go to sleep normally. You feel tired. Your body seems ready for rest. But then somewhere around 3 a.m., your eyes suddenly open. Sometimes you feel completely awake. Other times you wake up with a strange sense of alertness, even though your body still feels tired. Many people assume this is simply stress, or that it means their sleep quality is declining with age. But the body rarely works in such a simple way. In many cases, these early morning wake-ups are not random at all. They tend to appear when several quiet changes in the body begin to overlap. And interestingly, these changes often become noticeable after the age of 40. Understanding why this happens requires looking at how the body regulates sleep across the entire night. Because sleep is not one continuous state, it moves through carefully timed cycles. And the early morning hours are one of the most sensitive points in that system. Around 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., the body passes through a unique physiological transition. During this window, several internal systems shift at the same time. Core body temperature begins to rise. Hormone rhythms start preparing the body for waking. And the brain gradually moves from deep sleep toward lighter sleep stages. For younger adults, these transitions usually happen quietly. But after 40, the system that stabilizes. These cycles can become slightly less rigid, not broken, just more flexible and sometimes easier to disrupt. One of the most important factors behind this change involves sleep architecture. Sleep architecture refers to how the brain organizes different sleep stages throughout the night. When we are younger, deep sleep tends to dominate the early part of the night, while lighter sleep appears closer to morning. As we age, however, the proportion of deep sleep gradually decreases. This does not necessarily mean worse sleep, but it does mean the brain may spend more time in lighter sleep stages, especially during the early morning hours. And lighter sleep is far easier to interrupt. Small signals that the brain once ignored can suddenly become strong enough to wake us. A slight change in blood sugar, a shift in body temperature, a minor noise in the environment. Any of these can trigger a brief awakening. Another factor that becomes more noticeable after 40 is cortisol timing. Cortisol is often called the stress hormone, but its primary role is actually to help regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Under normal conditions, cortisol begins rising gradually in the early morning hours to prepare the body for waking. This rise usually starts somewhere between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. If the timing of this increase becomes slightly earlier or stronger, the brain may interpret it as a signal that morning is approaching. The result can be a sudden sense of alertness, even if it is still the middle of the night. This does not necessarily indicate a health problem. It is often simply a reflection of how the body's internal clock is adjusting over time. Blood sugar regulation can also play a role. During sleep, the body continues using glucose to fuel the brain and essential functions. In some people, especially after 40, the balance between insulin and nighttime glucose use can become slightly less stable. If blood sugar dips during the early morning hours, the body may respond by releasing adrenaline or cortisol to restore balance. These hormones can quickly increase alertness, which may lead to waking suddenly, often around the same time each night. Interestingly, many people report that these awakenings occur almost at the exact same hour, night after night. This pattern reflects the influence of the body's circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is the internal clock that coordinates sleep, hormones, metabolism, and temperature across a roughly 24-hour cycle. When the circadian system is strong and stable, the body transitions smoothly between sleep stages. But when the rhythm becomes slightly misaligned, even by a small margin, certain time windows can become more vulnerable to awakening. The 3 a.m. window happens to sit right at the center of this sensitive transition. Another change that often occurs after 40 involves melatonin signaling. Melatonin is the hormone that signals the body that night has begun. While melatonin production does not disappear with age, the timing and amplitude of its release can shift slightly. If melatonin levels begin declining earlier in the morning, the brain may move toward wakefulness sooner than expected. This does not necessarily shorten total sleep time, but it can increase the likelihood of brief awakenings in the early morning hours. Environmental factors can amplify this effect. Light exposure in the evening, irregular sleep schedules, and late meals can all influence how strongly the circadian rhythm holds its timing. Even small disruptions can become noticeable when the system is already in a more flexible state. Temperature regulation is another subtle contributor. During sleep, the body lowers its core temperature to support deep sleep stages. But near morning, the temperature begins rising again. This rise typically begins between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. If the sleeping environment is slightly too warm, or if bedding traps excess heat, the brain may interpret the rising temperature as a signal to wake. This is one reason many people notice they feel more alert around 3 a.m. Even when the room is quiet and dark, the body is simply moving toward its natural morning transition. There is also a psychological component. Once a person becomes aware of the pattern waking at the same time, repeatedly the brain may begin anticipating the event. Expectation itself can subtly increase nighttime alertness. Over time, the body learns the pattern, which can make the awakening feel even more consistent. However, in many cases these wake-ups are brief and temporary. The body often returns to sleep naturally once the internal signals settle. Sleep researchers sometimes describe this as a normal aging adjustment, rather than a disorder. In fact, short awakenings during the night are extremely common across all age groups. Most people simply do not remember them. What changes after 40 is not necessarily the number of awakenings, but the likelihood of becoming fully aware of them. When the brain spends more time in lighter sleep, consciousness can surface more easily, so the experience of waking at 3 a.m. may feel dramatic. Even though it is often part of a natural physiological transition. Interestingly, cultures throughout history have described similar nighttime awakenings. Before modern electric lighting, many people followed a sleep pattern known as segmented sleep. They would sleep for several hours, wake briefly in the middle of the night, and then return to sleep until morning. This pattern suggests that waking during the night may not be entirely unnatural. It may simply feel unusual in a modern environment that expects one continuous block of sleep. Of course, if early morning awakenings become frequent and are followed by long periods of alertness or fatigue during the day, it may be helpful to examine daily rhythms more closely. But for many people, occasional 3 a.m. wake-ups reflect nothing more than the body adjusting to subtle changes in sleep structure, hormone timing, and circadian rhythm. In other words, the body is not malfunctioning. It is simply moving through a different stage of its sleep pattern. Which raises an interesting question. If the body naturally shifts its sleep rhythm after 40, is it possible that the way we think about sleep schedules may also need to evolve over time? Because sometimes, what feels like a sleep problem may actually be the body quietly changing its rhythm.